My contention is that the challenge of global warming will not be resolved until three misconceptions about policy on it are set aside. They are that policy should be made by science, that it should aim for justice, and that it should be driven by despair. Either that the problem is so catastrophic that anything, no matter how improbable, expensive, or token, should be tried, or its opposite, that the situation is hopeless, so just live for today and come what may. Instead, it is necessary and sufficient to base policy on economic efficiency. To make this case, I need to clarify what economic efficiency means in this context, to say something about the instrument or instruments that will bring it about, and clarify who should catalyze this effort. Start with this gentleman, who most economists don't recognize because we don't recognize our own giants. This is Arthur Cecil Pigou, who a century ago gave us externalities, the concept which many economists use as the basis for their preferred global carbon tax, or its substitute, some would say superior substitute, of green subsidies and regulation on energy utilities. But that application of the Pigovian framing fails for three reasons. First, it muddles stocks and flows. In his original formulation, you have a noisy neighbour producing noise, a flow, which could be corrected by imposing a Pigovian tax on the noisy neighbour. Problem solved. And if you don't impose that Pigovian tax, you have destruction of value and the associated economic inefficiency. But that is not what happens with global warming. To see how, consider what happens if the world were now to impose a global carbon tax, which was by 2050 to drive global temperatures to the target of 1.5 degrees Celsius. But at that point, Jamaica and 140 or so other countries, that's 2 billion with a B people, whose combined contribution to the stock of emissions would remain negligible, would still have to live with the temperature and other consequences of 1.5 degrees Celsius, all for the convenience of the countries which are overwhelmingly responsible for that stock, namely the rich world. So, although a global carbon tax might drive temperatures to their target, by ignoring who is responsible for the stock of emissions, it fails to address this fundamental externality. And because it ignores that externality, it is associated with considerable destruction of value and with the associated economic inefficiency. To see how this destruction of value and the associated economic inefficiencies arise, consider the second failing of the derivation of global carbon taxes from the Pigovian framing, namely, that it considers global warming to be a single event, rather than as a single manifestation of a class of events. So, the standard story has it, you have industrializations from the mid-19th century, producing a large stock of emissions in the world, producing an associated rise in global temperatures, culminating in the single standalone problem of global temperatures with which we are now faced. But to the contrary, it is not a single standalone event. It is but one manifestation of a class of phenomena, namely international externalizations. These differ from their domestic counterparts in the absence of a sovereign to impose a Pigovian tax and in their increasing incidence. But as any Jamaican and similar audience will know intimately, the fact that there isn't a sovereign doesn't mean that there isn't a solution to this Pigovian problem. Because the Atlantic trade in people from the 15th to the 19th century was another instance of international externalization, namely of their preferences not to be owned, with consequent colossal destruction of economic value and economic inefficiencies. But this practice was not brought to an end by the imposition of a Pigovian tax. Instead, it was brought to an end by a series of precedents, notably rebellions, such that nowadays it is utterly unthinkable anywhere in the world for such practices to be lawful. International externalizations are not brought to an end by a sovereign imposing a Pigovian tax. They are brought to an end by precedent. And just as with their domestic counterparts, failure to bring them to an end generates colossal destruction of value and associated economic inefficiencies. Thus, a core purpose of policy on global warming should be to set a precedent on how future instances of international externalization will be resolved, covering the flows and the stocks. Failure to set this precedent in the context of global warming leaves all future instances of international externalizations unaddressed. And largely thanks to technology, the incidence of such international externalizations is rising and will rise considerably further, such that I would hold that 50 or 100 years from now, they will be if not the dominant characteristic of the international economy. Obviously, the problem is not unknown in the past. I've already cited the cases of the Atlantic trade in people and, of course, of global warming. But technology is greatly increasing the incidence of these things. Not only do you have every invasion of one country by another is an instance of international externalization, but in addition, take, for example, the research now going on to change the international location of rainfall. Imagine the international externalization properties of that. And furthermore, the underlying business model of social media is essentially externalization, much of which is international. Finally, I would note that even though there have been cases of international exports of narcotics, such as by the British government into China in the 19th century, still, I think the case of fentanyl should be looked at through this lens as well. Technology is greatly increasing the scope for international externalization. All of that means that the need for a precedent in how such matters will be dealt with is of paramount importance, as measured by the destruction of value and economic inefficiencies arising if that precedent is not set now by policy on global warming. And the third failing in the derivation of global carbon taxes from the Pigovian framing concerns redress. In his original framing, he makes very clear that the measure is not the penalty imposed on the offending party, the noisy neighbour, but is the return of the offended party to status ante. In that original example, silence. So in the case of global warming, where the need is to address the stock, what is the meaning of status ante redress for the externalized 140 or so countries whose contribution to the stock of emissions in the atmosphere is negligible and will remain negligible under any circumstances through to 2050? Well, perhaps the most obvious way to return Jamaica and the 140 or so other such similar countries back to status ante is to reset the target. The target should not be 1.5 degrees Celsius, it should be 0. The downside of doing that is that it is extraordinarily expensive. That would most certainly involve the recapture of all emissions since 1950, and quite possibly the recapture of all emissions since 1850. So an alternative means of returning the 140 or so countries to status ante would be to provide them with financial compensation in the form of grants. While that approach has some merit in that you could identify fairly clearly and cleanly who should pay for this, the task of identifying exactly who should receive exactly how much, in exactly what form, and exactly when, opens up a total quagmire of insoluble technical problems. Nevertheless, obviously the present approach, which is to lend money to the externalized countries, as for example under the Bridgetown Initiative, has no status within a Pigovian framing. So with those two means of securing status ante redress for the 140 countries ruled out, in the one instance because it's too expensive and the second because it's impractical, what is required is to reframe the meaning of status ante for the 140. And what I propose is that in status ante, the 140 had their development options unconstrained by emissions concerns. That was, of course, the case of what are now the industrial countries themselves. They also were emissions unconstrained in their paths for development starting in the mid-19th century. So rather than try and reset the global temperature goal, or to try and compensate the 140 for the costs of the associated temperature rises, an effective and least cost means of returning them to status ante in pursuit of the overall Pigovian strategy outlined is to relieve them of any carbon constraints on their own development. In addition, of course, in the relatively small number of cases where the costs of climate damage to the 140 can be identified and quantified reliably, such as in the case of the floods in Pakistan, compensation should be paid in full. But as these calculations in the broader scheme are all but impractical, the core solution to this status ante redress issue should be to relieve the 140 of all emissions constraints on their development. Thus, in terms of the policy framework on warming, the key phrase "for all" after net zero should be dropped, and the two constraint blocks should be put on notice that their objective is not net zero, but net recapture. Note, in light of all this, that science concerns itself only with temperature. It is not concerned at all with these other core stock aspects of warming. But if the 140 are to be relieved of any carbon constraints, that has to be rendered consistent with the global temperature target of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So how is that to be done? For that, we have to turn to the work of this gentleman, whom, like Pigou, most economists will not recognize. This is Jacques Polak, whose contribution was to the development of financial programming techniques of the IMF. Now, although the IMF's application of these techniques has brought them into some disrepute, that is neither his nor their fault. In essence, they simply are that if a complex economic objective is required, such as development of a country, this needs to be converted into internally consistent policies. That is, policies in one area need to be consistent with policies in another area in order that the whole should be consistent. Then, that those policies should be converted into a set of numerical targets, 4 key indicators, in order that policymakers can see as they go along whether or not they are on track. And last, he said, what is required is a set of mechanisms to drive adjustment if those indicators show that policy is off track, some mechanism of enforcement. So the principles are consistency, numerical accountability, and enforcement for any necessary corrections. That is exactly what is required to deliver the sort of global warming policies of a Pigovian type, in particular, to address the issue of the stock of emissions. So what does that look like? Well, you start with a need to have an internally consistent allocation of the global carbon budget. That is, the amount of emissions that can be emitted between now and 2050, consistent with the target of 1.5. And that remaining budget has to be divided up between, on the one hand, the 140 or so countries which will be emissions unconstrained, and on the other hand, the other countries which will be constrained. Given estimates of the relation between the stock of emissions and global temperature trends, that is a simple sum. To see intuitively how it works, this chart shows the rise in global temperatures since 1960, rising to where they are now, about 1 degree Celsius above mid-19th century levels. Then superimposed on that, on the right-hand side, you can see the contribution of the 3 major blocks of countries to use of the global carbon budget. So the sliver of green is the contribution to the stock of the 140 or so countries, including Jamaica, so far. The bottom red block is the contribution to the global stock from the OECD countries. And the third block in blue is the contribution to the stock of the 15 or so large non-OECD emitters. So that includes China, India, Russia, and so on. The allocation of the remaining budget to 1.5 degrees Celsius is designed simply by running forward a projection of that green slither out to 2050 on the assumption that it is emissions unconstrained, and then as a residual calculating what is left for the red and the blue box. That's for the OECD and for the large non-OECD emitters. Once that global budget allocation is calculated, it then needs to be converted into the set of numerical indicators which will show year by year whether or not the two constrained blocks are on track to meet the global target. That is, in principle and largely in practice, a similarly straightforward calculation. This chart shows the emissions intensity of output of those three blocks since 1960. That is, the tons of carbon dioxide they're emitting per $10,000 of real GDP. What this shows so far is that all three blocks have made considerable progress in reducing the emissions intensity of output in the last 60 years, and is therefore a direct refutation of counsels of despair on this matter. In principle, therefore, to derive annual target numbers for the two constrained blocks going forward from now to 2050, all you do is take their global allocation, their share of the global budget, which we just calculated, take projections of their output going forward, and you derive the necessary paths for the emissions intensity of output of the blue block and the red block, consistent with the global target of 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2050. And those two derived paths for the OECD and for the large emitter non-OECD block respectively comprise the annual targets year by year against which progress towards the ultimate target can and should be measured. And those annual targets should be defined on the emissions intensity of output, not least because, were they to be defined on emissions instead, measurement of progress would be distorted by large cyclical downturns, as for example happened during the global COVID recession. And because the aim is not to meet the temperature target at any cost, but is to meet it at minimal cost to global output. And the targets should be defined not for individual countries within the OECD, but for the OECD bloc as a whole, and for the bloc of large non-OECD emitters as a whole. And the reason for that is that in a Pigovian setting, the externalized 140 countries do not care which members of the OECD contribute to getting global temperatures to target. They just care that the temperatures are on target. Hence, the correct locus for the targets is not individual countries in the OECD and so on, but is at block level for the OECD and for the block of large non-OECD emitters, respectively. So with the path of annual targets for these two blocks set for their emissions intensity of output, what is the enforcement mechanism in case that one or other or both of them deviate from their target paths and need to be driven back on to target? Well, in the first instance, if, say, the OECD bloc overshoots its annual target in 1 year, the first thing that should be done is that those OECD members which perform worst on the emissions intensity of output should be named and shamed. These data are readily available and are shown for 2020, where you can see that in that year, by far the worst performers on emissions intensity of output were, in the OECD, Australia, Canada and South Korea. And amongst the other group of large non-OECD emitters, it was Iran, Kazakhstan and South Africa. Similarly, those countries which perform particularly well should be praised. In the OECD, that is Switzerland, Denmark and Sweden. And in the other group, it's Brazil, Indonesia and India. But of course, naming and shaming only gets you so far with regard to enforcement. So If it turns out that naming and shaming does not suffice to drive the blocks onto their target paths, then I propose an emissions inefficiency tariff, which reflects the Pigovian principles regarding stocks of emissions and which reflects Pollack's principles of consistency and enforcement. So, if, for example, the OECD bloc misses an annual target, then the 3 worst OECD members on emissions intensity of output would become subject that year to a hefty tariff on their exports, amounting, for example, to 1% of their GDP. In other words, a really stinging penalty. That framework would be applied annually. So in any year in the future in which the OECD misses its target path, the 3 worst performing of its members would become subject to this tariff in that year. Similarly and separately for the block of large non-OECD emitters. What this tax framework does is set up a process of competition within each block to drive their emissions intensities of output down, in order that even if a country is relatively emissions efficient now, it does not, through complacency, find itself overtaken by others, and thus become liable to this emissions inefficiency tariff. So even though in any one year the tax only applies to the worst performing members, all members of the 2 blocks are put under pressure to drive their emissions intensities down. 2 things are worth emphasizing about this structure. First of all, unlike carbon taxes, which address only the flow, this structure addresses the stock, because the 140 are not liable. And secondly, this structure is highly parsimonious. There is no prescription for any individual OECD member as to what it should do precisely in order to get its emissions intensity of output down. It is completely free to choose which instrument, and that could include carbon taxes, it uses to get emissions intensity down. But its overall decision-making is now constrained by the emissions inefficiency tariff, which is triggered by the aggregate performance of the block of which it is a member. So it is a highly parsimonious structure involving a single tax on each of the 2 blocks without any prescription with regard to, say, what to do with airlines or eating meat or the inequality within a country or carbon taxes or use of subsidies or any of the whole plethora of instruments which are available to sovereigns in order to get carbon emissions down. That parsimony is not only important in principle, it will also help to generate global consensus for this enforcement mechanism because interference is avoided. But all those who should be are accountable, not on the basis of uncertain promises, but on the basis of timely measurement of outturns. And in contrast to the degrowth agenda, which presumes that output has to be sacrificed to temperature goals without specifying how much or how that is to be accomplished or by whom, the emissions inefficiency tariff operates as a search instrument to find and apply the output sacrifice minimizing solution that delivers the Pigovian standard. Thus, given technology and the aggregate sovereign policy choices in the constrained blocks, if emissions efficiencies are inadequate to meet the temperature goals at full growth potential, then the tax avoidance incentives generated by the tariff will drive output outturns in the constrained blocks down, but only as necessary. And as that lower output trajectory emerges, so the underlying assumptions on trend growth in the underlying programming framework can be reset. And if, as a result of all this, some emissions-intensive activity shifts to the 140, that is a feature, not a bug, because the fundamental objective is not temperature, but is economic efficiency. Any such shifts merely dent the gulf between the cumulative per capita emissions of the 140 and those of the OECD, appropriately increasing the onus on the constrained blocks to act. There is no place in the Pigovian framing for border adjustment taxes to stop this. And finally, note that in contrast to policy which is based on justice, this yields specific, numerical, accountable, enforceable policy. And so, who is going to catalyze this Pigovian enforceable framework and make it happen? Unfortunately, it's not going to be the rich world as a whole, nor the international financial institutions, NGOs, or the economics profession, which they control, because they are responsible for the bulk of the stock. Hence, they have no interest in talking about the stock. They just want, as does science, to talk about the flows. So, the catalytic burden inevitably falls on Jamaica and the other 140 or so countries which have been internationally externalized. They have to speak up for themselves and therefore for these underlying principles of efficiency. But note that I'm not calling on them to form some kind of third way or some new kind of non-aligned movement, or once again to stand in supplication with their hands out. The principles that they are defending are the most conventional in economics. And there's nothing more orthodox than the application of IMF Financial Programming techniques. And that orthodoxy is a central part of its authority. So what is proposed is that the 140 countries as a bloc should collectively assert these principles, should collectively make the calculations to convert them into practical annual targets, and whether or not the rich world agrees, produce assessments of the annual outturns against these targets. These should be central to this group of countries' contributions to each of the annual COP climate conventions. Thus, the first step is assertion. But note, this effort can acquire allies amongst the rich world. And apart from its parsimony, there are two key means of doing so. First, this chart shows for the OECD the emissions intensity of output relative to average for all of its members for 2020. There on the far left, you can see Australia, Canada and Korea as the worst performers. But for now, cast your eye to the right-hand side of this chart. There you can see there's a large number of OECD countries which face little risk of becoming liable for the emissions inefficiency tariff, yet their own exceptional efforts to getting carbon emissions down globally are being ridden over by their much more emissions inefficient colleagues in the OECD, including Australia, Canada, and Korea. A good set of these countries on the right-hand side of this chart are persuadable to sign up for a global emissions inefficiency tariff of the kind that the 140 or so countries would propose. And the second mechanism by which the 140 can find allies amongst this group concerns the arrangement for the revenue allocation from this tariff. In order to encourage participation more broadly amongst the rich countries, the revenue from the emissions inefficiency tariff should be allocated not as a means of achieving redistribution across the world, but in proportion to each recipient country's GDP. So, for example, Germany, if it was to be in receipt of some of this tariff charged on somebody else, would get a share of the total revenue according to Germany's share in global GDP. What this does is give a revenue incentive for rich countries to participate. Now, in the event of this just being Australia, Canada, and Korea, the sums of money involved here may be relatively small. But again, look at this chart and you'll see that number 6 in the list of inefficient countries here is the United States. If 1% of United States GDP is to be distributed amongst other members of the world through the emissions inefficiency tariff in the event that the United States finds itself in the group of the worst 3 of the OECD members, that is a very considerable amount of revenue. But such as Germany would only gain a share of that revenue if they participate in the emissions intensity tariff by applying it and by agreeing to be subject to it themselves. Thus, this arrangement on revenue, along with parsimony of the arrangement itself, and with the more efficient members' desire not to be free-ridden over by others, will encourage rich countries to sign up, even though, as a whole, collectively, they do not have an interest in a Pigovian-style framework which is addressing the stock of emissions. And the last point to make about this search for allies is that if individual countries decline to participate, they cannot veto this operation done by others. Countries which elect not to participate in the emissions inefficiency tariff will simply thereby lose access to the revenue that it generates. And they will find themselves cast in the role of global climate pariahs. As noted, the calculations on emissions intensity which underlie this whole framework should be done annually. And indeed, I have already done this annual assessment for 2021. What it shows is not only that the 2 blocks are already off track in 2021 from their target paths, but what's even more alarming is that the steady progress which both the OECD and the bloc of non-OECD big emitters have been making for the last 60 years in their emissions intensity of output came essentially to a sudden stop in 2021. That this finding comes as alarming news to you only now is because this framework has not yet been catalyzed by the group of 140 countries, and they did not raise this issue, even though the most recent COP was held in Egypt and was dubbed the African COP. The implications for 2022, if this sudden stop has continued, are absolutely dire. If it turns out that the sudden stop has persisted into 2022, then the case for an emissions inefficiency tariff becomes overwhelming, because the 2 emissions-constrained blocks need to be driven back onto their target paths quickly. All this is quite a lot to ask of the 140 or so countries who have been internationally externalized. But they should not seek to be given some sort of equal role at the global top table on this. They need, as a means of securing good global governance of this whole issue, to assert their role at the global top table on this matter, whether or not the OECD and other countries accommodate them. And if the Pigovian framing seems to be too much bother for the OECD, note that had the precedent been established by 1500, no one would have been subjected to the Atlantic trade in people. No one. Not because of some Damascene moral conversion of people owners, but because the expected private returns to their preferred technology would have been negative. If that does not seem worth a bother to the OECD, I simply cannot agree. And if all this seems too much to ask of the 140's policymakers, given the crush of immediate challenges they all face, note, it does not take a new institution nor make burdensome demands on their time. Given data availability, the numerical work for the annual assessments can be completed by one person on one iPad in under a week, and the rest is liaison and advocacy. And far from merely advancing their own private interests, were the 140 to do this, they would be advancing a great global public good, namely the precedent that in the event of further international externalizations, the consequences will be corrected, covering both flows and stocks, with the burden of correction falling fully, as it should, on the externalizing party, whomever they may be. The benefits of that for the world are for the ages. So, the 140 should not wait. When Mr. Marley challenged the Jamaicans and others to get up, stand up, it was not because he thought it inevitable that they would, nor that victory was inevitable if they did. It was because he knew what was inevitable if they did not.